Most men do not collapse in battle, they collapse in comfort. They are not destroyed by tragedy, but by permission. A softer bed, an easier excuse, one more indulgence, one more delay, until the edge within them grows dull and their own life begins to feel heavy in their hands. Bushido understood this long before the modern world made comfort into a religion. It taught that a man who cannot deny himself cannot command himself, and a man who cannot command himself will eventually be ruled by fear, appetite, and mood. In old Japan, the warrior was not trained merely to fight an enemy. He was trained to endure the burden of being awake, to rise before desire, to act before emotion, to remain still when the mind begged for escape. Miyamoto Musashi, who spent much of his life in hardship, did not write about building a pleasant life. He wrote about clarity, discipline, detachment, and the hard refinement of the self. He understood that comfort is not always rest. Very often comfort is surrender disguised as kindness. There is a form of suffering that purifies, and another that weakens. Bushido never glorified pain for its own sake, but it did demand a willingness to stand where lesser men would retreat. Not because endurance is impressive, but because truth is usually found after the point where preference ends. The person who cannot remain present in difficulty will never know his real shape. He will only know the soft outline of what he becomes when life stops pressing against him. Chapter 1. The Quiet Addiction. Kenji was 36 years old when he began to suspect that nothing was wrong with his life and that this was exactly the problem. He had work that paid enough, a clean apartment, food when he wanted it, and the private freedom to arrange his days around convenience. No one would have called him weak. He met his obligations, spoke politely, and carried himself with enough order to avoid obvious failure. But beneath this surface there was a constant low exhaustion, not of the body but of the spirit. He woke each morning already negotiating with himself. 10 more minutes in bed. A simpler meal instead of a better one. A delayed conversation, a postponed decision, a task shifted to tomorrow. Nothing dramatic, nothing shameful, nothing that could be pointed to as the source of decay. And yet he could feel it. His life was not collapsing under the weight of catastrophe. It was being quietly hollowed out by all the things he kept allowing. At night, when the room was finally still, he noticed the truth he spent the day avoiding. He no longer trusted himself, not in any grand theatrical sense, but in the smallest and most important way. When he made a promise to himself, some part of him already expected it to be revised, softened, or abandoned. This is how inner authority dies. Not with one betrayal, but with many merciful exceptions. One winter evening after leaving work later than usual, Kenji stopped by a small used bookstore on a side street he normally passed without noticing. He had no reason to enter, only a vague reluctance to return home and repeat the same evening he had repeated 100 times before. In a back corner between dusty histories and old essays, he found a worn edition of teachings attributed to warriors and monks of feudal Japan. He turned pages casually at first, then more slowly. The words were stern, spare, almost cold. But in their severity he sensed something he had not felt in years: respect. The men who wrote these teachings did not flatter weakness. They did not ask how to make life more pleasant. They asked how to become inwardly ungovernable by discomfort. They wrote as if the first task of a serious life was not to feel better, but to become harder to move. In one passage, the spirit of Bushido appeared not as cruelty but as refusal. Refusal to be ruled by appetite, refusal to complain, refusal to drift. Kenji bought the book and carried it home in silence. He did not yet know that this was the beginning. He only knew that the voices in those pages did not speak to the part of him that wanted relief. They spoke to the part of him that had grown ashamed of wanting it all the time. Something old had stirred. Not ambition, not inspiration. Something more severe than both. Chapter 2. What Bushido actually demands. Bushido is often misunderstood because modern people hear only its outer language and miss its inner requirement. They imagine swords, armor, loyalty, and death. But the deepest demand of the way was not spectacle. It was self-command. Before the warrior could meet the world properly, he had to become a person whose body did not lead him, whose fears did not instruct him, and whose desires did not vote on every action. This is why Zen moved so naturally beside the warrior tradition. Zen stripped away ornament and forced a confrontation with what remained when distraction ended. It taught presence without indulgence, awareness without complaint, simplicity without self-pity. The samurai did not seek comfort because comfort weakens attention. A person accustomed to constant ease becomes fragile. The smallest inconvenience begins to feel like injury, and the smallest denial begins to feel like loss. Musashi understood this with particular sharpness. He advised a life that did not become attached to preference. Do not seek pleasure for its own sake. Do not cling to possessions. Do not depend on luxury. To modern ears, this can sound austere to the point of harshness, but the logic is exact. Whatever you become unable to do without becomes your master. The way of no comfort is not the rejection of all peace, rest, or beauty. It is the rejection of dependence. Bushido asks a harder question than most people are willing to face. What has become necessary for you that was once optional? What conditions must now be perfect before you can act with clarity, patience, or discipline? The answer reveals the size of your prison. When Kenji began reading each night, he noticed how much of his life had been arranged around avoiding even mild forms of inner friction. He was not enslaved by great pleasures. He was governed by small permissions. He needed the right mood to begin difficult work. He needed ease in order to remain calm. He needed reassurance before making clear decisions. The ancient texts made him see something brutal. Dependence on comfort is still dependence. This realization did not make him heroic. It made him quiet. For several days, he carried the thought around like a stone. He saw it in the way he reached for his phone during moments of uncertainty. He saw it in the food he used to soften stress, in the noise he used to avoid silence, in the endless small negotiations that kept him from encountering himself directly. The enemy was not outside him. It was the invisible habit of retreat. Chapter 3. The First Cut. Transformation rarely begins with intensity. More often, it begins with a subtraction. In Japanese tradition shaped by Zen and discipline, mastery does not first mean adding more techniques. It means removing what is unnecessary. The sword is sharpened by taking metal away. Character is sharpened by the same law. Before one can become stronger, one must stop feeding weakness. Kenji did not redesign his life. He made a single decision. For the first hour of every morning, he would allow himself nothing that softened him. No phone, no music, no unnecessary warmth of distraction. He would rise at the first alarm, wash, sit in silence for 10 minutes, clean one small area of his apartment, and then begin the hardest task of the day before breakfast. It did not look impressive. That was precisely why it mattered. Bushido does not begin in dramatic moments. It begins in the unseen refusal to obey appetite. The warrior spirit is not measured by how loudly one declares his principles, but by what he does before the world is watching. A person who cannot win the first hour of the day will not suddenly become sovereign by afternoon. He will simply be more articulate in his excuses. The first morning was humiliating. Kenji woke tired and immediately felt the full force of his own resistance. The room was cold. The floor beneath his feet felt unkind. His mind produced reasons that sounded intelligent. He needed more rest, a gentler beginning, a better plan. But he had already begun to understand something vital. Comfort does not always speak in the language of laziness. Often it speaks in the language of self-care, prudence, and balance, while quietly protecting the old weakness underneath. He stood anyway. He sat in silence while his thoughts turned restless and petty. He cleaned the kitchen counter with irritation. He opened his work and felt a dense wave of reluctance. Nothing in him felt transformed. There was no purity, no nobility, only friction. Yet this was the first true victory, because for once he had acted without waiting to agree with himself. That small sequence became his first non-negotiable law, not because it made him efficient, but because it restored a forgotten hierarchy. Action first, mood later, duty first, preference later. This is one of the hidden principles beneath the ancient Japanese disciplines. The self is not stabilized by discussion, but by repeated form. You do not think your way into firmness. You behave your way into it. Chapter 4. The Resistance of the Self. Once a person stops serving comfort, something unexpected happens. He meets the part of himself that comfort had been hiding. This is why many people abandon discipline just as it begins to work. They assume the return of agitation means something is wrong. In truth, it often means something real has finally been uncovered. As the days continued, Kenji became more irritable, not less. Without constant entertainment and softness to buffer his thoughts, old dissatisfaction rose to the surface. He noticed resentments he had buried, envy he pretended not to feel, and a helplessness that had been concealed beneath his routines. Silence did not calm him immediately. It exposed him. The ancient disciplines know this well. Before stillness becomes peace, it often becomes confrontation. Zen training has always contained this severity. To sit in stillness is not to float above life. It is to remain present while the mind reveals its untidy contents. Bushido added another demand. Do not flee from what you see. The warrior is not the man with no fear or no confusion. He is the man who does not let fear and confusion decide what happens next. One evening after a difficult day, Kenji stood in front of the refrigerator longer than necessary, searching for something to blunt his mood. He was not hungry. He knew this. What he wanted was sedation. In that ordinary kitchen under weak light, he suddenly understood how much of his life had been built around not feeling the full weight of his own unfinished state. He closed the door and stood there with empty hands. That moment was small enough to seem forgettable, yet it contained a real shift. For the first time in years, he did not immediately answer discomfort with relief. He let the agitation remain. He washed a cup, sat down, and read a passage from Musashi instead. Not because reading solved anything, but because it reminded him of the path he had chosen. The goal was not to eliminate discomfort. The goal was to stop kneeling before it. This is what the way of no comfort demands. Not permanent hardness, not joyless living. It demands that you stop organizing your life around avoiding pressure. The body may ask for ease, the mind may ask for escape, but character is formed when neither request is automatically granted. A person becomes trustworthy to himself when he can feel the pull of indulgence and still remain where he has decided to stand. Chapter 5. The Discipline of Less. As the weeks passed, Kenji noticed that discipline did not make life larger at first. It made it smaller. Fewer distractions, fewer choices, fewer permissions. He ate more simply, spoke less casually, and began ending his evenings at a fixed hour. He reduced his possessions, not out of aesthetic preference, but because clutter had become a form of mental softness. Every excess object seemed to whisper the same message. You can postpone clarity a little longer. There is a stern beauty in Japanese austerity when it is properly understood. It is not emptiness for decoration. It is emptiness for precision. In the tea room, in the dojo, in the calligrapher's brushwork, in the monk's cell, one finds the same principle repeated. Remove what diffuses the mind. The warrior too must learn this art. Not all comfort comes from cushions and heat. Much of it comes from abundance without necessity. Kenji applied this principle to his speech. He stopped explaining himself so quickly. He stopped trying to make every silence pleasant. At work, he noticed how often people spoke to reduce tension rather than to express truth. He had done the same for years. Now he began to practice a quieter form of presence. He answered directly, withheld unnecessary complaint, and let certain moments remain unfilled. This change had an effect he did not expect. He began to feel stronger not when life became easier, but when he stopped leaking energy through excess reaction. Complaint, he realized, is a subtle luxury. It gives the ego a momentary feeling of importance while weakening endurance. Bushido rejects this not because suffering should be romanticized, but because the undisciplined tongue trains the undisciplined mind. He also began walking home without headphones. At first, this seemed insignificant, but the silence changed the texture of the evening. Instead of dissolving into noise, he had to inhabit his own thoughts as the city darkened around him. Sometimes the walk was unpleasant. Sometimes it was clean and almost sacred. Either way, he was no longer fleeing himself. Chapter 6. Falling, then standing correctly. No serious discipline unfolds in a straight line. The modern mind likes the fantasy of clean ascent, but the old traditions knew better. A swordsman misses. A monk wanders. A student forgets the form and must return to it again. What matters is not uninterrupted purity. What matters is the speed and honesty of return. After nearly 2 months of steadiness, Kenji had a week of collapse. Work intensified, sleep thinned. He began checking his phone late into the night again, skipping the morning silence, breaking the order he had built. The old softness returned quickly, as if it had merely been waiting nearby. This shocked him. He had imagined that progress once gained would remain. Instead, he learned a harsher truth. Neglect revives weakness with alarming speed. For one evening, he felt the full force of discouragement. He accused himself of pretending, of borrowing discipline from books without truly becoming different. But the teachings he had been reading offered no sympathy for this kind of drama. Self-condemnation can also be indulgence. It keeps attention fixed on emotion instead of duty. the warrior corrects. He does not perform disappointment for himself. The next morning, Kenji returned to the first action. He rose with the alarm. He washed. He sat in silence. He cleaned the table. He began his work. Nothing was repaired all at once, but the axis had been restored. This is one of the deepest lessons of Bushido and Zen alike. Do not build your identity on your feelings about yourself. Build it on what you return to. This is why form matters so much. Under pressure, a person does not rise to his ideals, he falls to his training. If your life has no form, difficulty will scatter you. If your actions are built on mood, stress will dissolve them. But if certain small actions have been made sacred through repetition, then even after failure, the path back remains visible. Kenji no longer asked whether he felt disciplined. He asked whether he was keeping the form. The question was simpler and more demanding. The answer could not be decorated. Either he was standing correctly or he was not. This relieved him of vanity. He no longer needed to feel impressive. He only needed to remain faithful. Chapter 7. The Inner Climate Changes. By the third month, the most important changes in Kenji were not visible from the outside. He still lived in the same apartment, worked the same job, and moved through the same city. But the relation between him and discomfort had shifted. He no longer interpreted every inconvenience as a problem to solve. He no longer believed every impulse deserved an answer. There was more space between sensation and obedience. This is where the way of no comfort begins to reveal its hidden gift. At first, it appears to take things away. Ease, indulgence, noise, spontaneity, relief. But what it returns is far greater. It returns independence. Not the political kind, nor the romantic kind, but the inward kind. The ability to remain intact when the preferred condition is absent. Musashi wrote in the spirit of this freedom, "Do not let your body be guided by pleasure. Do not let your mind be clouded by attachment. Do not regret what you have done." These are not merely moral commands. They are instructions for becoming difficult to enslave. Anyone can appear composed when life is agreeable. The true test is whether one remains ordered when nothing in the environment offers support. Kenji began noticing this in small moments. A delayed train no longer unraveled his mind. Hunger before a meal no longer felt urgent. An uncomfortable conversation no longer demanded immediate escape. He was not numb. He was simply less available to panic. The mind that had once been easily moved by minor discomfort was becoming heavier, steadier, less eager to bend. He also discovered a kind of gratitude he had never felt during his softer years. Not gratitude for comfort, but gratitude for sufficiency. A plain meal after honest effort. A clean room at the end of the day. Silence that did not accuse him. Fatigue, earned rather than drifted into. The old traditions understood this well. Pleasure consumed constantly becomes dull. Simplicity, when entered through discipline, becomes luminous. Chapter 8. What Bushido demands from you. The way of no comfort does not ask you to hate life. It asks you to stop worshiping ease. It asks you to examine every habit that has made you dependent on convenience, stimulation, praise, or escape. It asks you to notice how often you delay the necessary until the unpleasant feeling arrives, and how much of your character has been handed over to conditions you do not control. Bushido demands that you become the kind of person who can act rightly in the absence of preference. It demands that you separate need from indulgence, peace from softness, rest from surrender. It demands that you learn the discipline of enough, enough food, enough speech, enough possession, enough explanation. Beyond that point, excess usually begins to erode strength. This is not a path for performance. The deepest parts of it are quiet, rising when no one sees, withholding complaint when sympathy is available, remaining still when distraction is within reach, returning to form after failure without ceremony. These are not glamorous acts, but they shape the soul more completely than public victories ever will. The modern world will rarely instruct you in this way. It profits from your weakness, flatters your impulses, and offers relief before understanding. It tells you to make yourself comfortable before asking anything serious of yourself. Bushido reverses the order. First become reliable, first become inwardly stable. Then you may begin to touch freedom. Kenji did not become a different species of man. He remained human, vulnerable to fatigue, irritation, and uncertainty. But he was no longer a servant to every passing state. And that changed the moral atmosphere of his life. He walked with less haste. He spoke with less leakage. He worked with less bargaining. There was a firmness in him now that had not come from confidence, but from repeated refusal. Perhaps that is the real demand hidden within the old warrior code. Not violence, not severity for display, but the courage to live without being constantly protected from the friction that forms you. To stop asking comfort to tell you who you are. To stop seeking softness where strength is required. To become someone who does not need life to be gentle in order to remain upright within it. So when discomfort comes, do not ask first how to escape it. Ask what it reveals. Ask what dependency it exposes. Ask which part of you is panicking because it has been overfed for too long. Then return to the form, rise, wash, sit, clean, begin. Make a few actions sacred and let them stand above mood. In time, this quiet obedience will do what grand emotion never could. It will make your inner life simpler, cleaner, and harder to move. You will discover that peace is not given to the person who arranges perfect conditions. It is given to the person who no longer requires them. And when that day comes, you will understand why the old warriors distrusted comfort, not because they loved suffering, but because they loved freedom more. They are each way of